The quiet ones never ask for anything. That's what Dr. Lawrence Mercer observed about Rachel Torres during her first week at St. Michael's Hospital in Denver. Not that he was watching her specifically, but that his eyes happened to land on her while she moved through the ICU during morning rounds, and what he saw irritated him in a way he couldn't quite name. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She didn't volunteer opinions about patient care. She didn't position herself at the front of the group where ambitious residents clustered, elbowing for his attention and approval. Instead, she stood at the periphery, chart in hand, dark hair pulled so tight it seemed to stretch the skin at her temples, wearing scrubs that were somehow more pressed than anyone else's despite being a temp nurse who'd only been at the hospital for 6 months. Her eyes stayed fixed on the paper in front of her. Efficient. Invisible. Competent in a way that required no acknowledgement. Mercer hated that. He was 6'7", silver-haired at 54, with shoulders that had played linebacker at Northwestern before medical school derailed that trajectory. The kind of man whose presence changed the air pressure in a room, who expected it to change, who relied on that shift as confirmation of his place at the top of whatever hierarchy he occupied. In his 23 years as chief of surgery at St. Michael's, he'd built a reputation on surgical skill and something else, something that tasted like power, the ability to make residents sweat, to make nurses recount their decisions in excruciating detail, to deploy silence as a weapon during rounds when someone, anyone, said something he deemed insufficient. The hierarchy required fear. Fear required a man who was willing to maintain it. Mercer was nothing if not committed to maintenance. But Rachel Torres didn't seem to fear him, and that was the problem. It wasn't that she was rude. That would have been easier to punish, more straightforward. Instead, she was professional in a way that suggested respect without deference, courtesy without subordination. When he asked her a question during rounds, she answered directly. "Yes, doctor." The post-op labs came back at 7:45, "Doctor." The family requested another pain assessment at 14:30, "Doctor." The words themselves were perfect. The tone was the issue. It suggested that she was acknowledging his rank but not his dominance, the way you might address a mail carrier, polite, correct, but implying a mutual humanity that had no hierarchy at all. The antiseptic smell of the fourth-floor ICU seemed sharper as Mercer watched her work the Hendricks room on a Thursday in March. That was the other thing, she was efficient. Her hands moved with a precision that suggested either obsessive attention to detail or training so deep it had become automatic. She hung and fore on the first stick, the catheter sliding in clean, no fishing around in the patient's arm like so many of the other nurses, no hesitation in her movements. Her voice stayed steady when she explained the post-operative timeline to Mrs. Hendricks, who sat rigid in the visitor's chair, her husband still sedated and aching from his appendectomy. Rachel didn't rush. She didn't linger. She did the work in exactly the time it required and nothing more. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound Mercer had stopped noticing years ago, but which seemed to mark the rhythm of Rachel's movements, a steady, metronomic competence that required no input from him, no direction, no validation. She didn't glance at him for approval. She didn't check for his presence at the doorway. It was as though he wasn't there, as though the entire room functioned in a universe where Dr. Lawrence Mercer was decorative rather than essential. Mercer's jaw tightened. He made a note in his tablet and said nothing. The problem was that the other nurses noticed her too, though in a different way. They didn't resent her, not yet. Instead, they seemed to respect her with a kind of quiet recognition that came from watching someone do their job without complaint, without asking for help they didn't actually need, without the constant low-level drama that most hospital floors ran on. She picked up extra shifts. She covered gaps in the schedule without complaining. When Sarah Chen called in sick with the flu, Rachel added a second shift to her week, a double, and charted through it without mentioning exhaustion or asking for breaks. When the supply room ran short on sterile dressing kits, Rachel improvised and made do. When a patient in 412 asked for coffee at 3:33 a.m., she heated it and brought it without the resentment that radiated off most night shift nurses like body heat. She was the kind of nurse that made a hospital run. She was also the kind of nurse that made men like Dr. Mercer uneasy. That night, After the 15-hour shift ended and the hospital settled into its evening rhythm, the visiting hours closing, the emergency room transitioning to a different kind of chaos, the ICU lights dimmed to accommodate patients trying to sleep, Rachel made her way to the staff locker room on the 4th floor. The smell of old metal and the lingering ghost of perfume and deodorant hung in the cool air. Her locker was near the back, tucked away where the foot traffic was lightest. She spun the combination, the 23rd of July, 18. The metal door swung open with the kind of squeak that suggested the hinges needed replacing sometime in the next fiscal year. The locker was sparse. A change of clothes. A pair of running shoes with the laces tied in a specific way, a military tight, military neat. A water bottle covered in faded tape residue where unit patches once had been, the adhesive still visible like a ghost of what had been there. And in the corner, resting on the narrow shelf above the hanging rail, was the flag. It was folded into a triangle, the way the military folds them for the families of the fallen. The fabric was cotton, a little faded from 18 months in a locker, the red and white stripes still vibrant but the blue canton slightly sun-damaged from the time before that, when it had draped a casket in Helmand Province. Rachel's hand reached for it without conscious decision, the way a tongue finds a missing tooth. Her fingers traced the edge of the fold, the precise hospital corner that had been maintained by someone who understood the geometry of respect. 3 men. She could see their faces if she closed her eyes. She didn't close her eyes. Instead, she let her fingertips rest on the fabric for 7 seconds, long enough to remember, short enough to function. Then she tucked the flag back into place and closed the locker door, spinning the combination so the lock snapped shut with a sound like a rifle bolt. The walk to her car took 4 minutes. The parking garage was half full, the evening cool enough that her breath didn't fog, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls in a rhythm that sounded almost military. Almost practiced. Almost like something she'd left behind in the mountains of Paktika province with 2 of the 3 men whose faces she carried. Back at St. Michael's, on the 4th floor ICU, Dr. Mercer stood at the nursing station reviewing patient charts. His eyes landed on Rachel's shift notes from the Hendricks room, precise, comprehensive, with documentation that suggested an understanding of post-operative care that went beyond standard training. She'd flagged a slight elevation in the patient's white blood cell count at 9:30, recommended a follow-up culture at 2 p.m., and noted the family's concerns about pain management with the kind of attention that suggested she'd actually listened rather than simply checked a box. It was good work. Competent work. The kind of work that made a hospital run. It was also the kind of work that could make a doctor look bad if the narrative shifted. If someone started whispering that the chief of surgery had missed what a temp nurse caught. If the story became Dr. Mercer didn't notice the infection developing but Rachel did. If the hierarchy fractured, even slightly, because people started looking to someone else for answers. Mercer closed the chart and set his tablet down. The humming of the fluorescent light seemed louder than before. He would watch her more carefully. He would look for something, anything, that justified his instinct that this quiet competence was actually something else entirely. A threat dressed up as professionalism. An ambition masked as humility. The kind of person who smiled while they dismantled everything you'd built. The kind of person you had to eliminate before they understood their own power. Mercer left the nursing station without another word, his footsteps heavy on the tile floor, leaving the ICU to its beeping monitors and sleeping patients and the ghost of a nurse who'd already disappeared into the Denver night, carrying a flag that nobody knew she owned. Room 347 smelled like antiseptic and expensive cologne. Dr. Lawrence Mercer stood at the bedside of Colonel James Hendricks, a man whose uniform hung loose on a frame that had shed 30 pounds to infection and morphine. The chart read simple: pneumonia post-op, managed pain, discharge in 48 hours. Mercer held the tablet like a general surveying a conquered territory, his 6'7" frame casting a shadow across the patient's face. "We'll start morphine at 4 milligrams for every 4 hours, Mercer said, tapping the order into the system without looking at the numbers twice. His voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to obedience, residents hung on his words, nurses executed without question, families nodded gratefully at his bedside manner. Mrs. Hendricks sat in the visitor's chair, her hands folded in her lap, watching the chief of surgery with the reverence people reserve for gods who hold their husbands' lives in their hands. Rachel Torres stood at the medication cart outside room 347, entering orders into the Pyxis machine when the fluorescent panel above her head flickered once, twice, then stabilized. She'd been a temp at St. Michael's for 6 months. 6 months of invisible shifts, of arriving early and leaving late, of charting with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was the only shield a nurse without hospital politics possessed. She pulled Colonel Hendricks' chart from the queue and read the morphine order. Her eyes moved to his lab values from that morning. Creatinine, 2.1. Glomerular filtration rate, 28. Renal function that suggested his kidneys were processing medications like a rusty water filter. She walked back into room 347. Her shoes made no sound on the linoleum, for skill developed in places where stealth mattered more than speed. "Excuse me, doctor," she said quietly. "The patient's renal function suggests we should reduce the morphine to 2 milligrams." The room went silent. A silence so complete you could hear the ventilator hum in the adjacent space, could hear Mrs. Hendricks' breath catch, could hear the small sound of Mercer's pen stopping against the tablet. Dr. Mercer turned to face her with the deliberate slowness of a man who had just been contradicted by someone he'd never fully registered as existing. His face was granite, his jaw a line drawn in stone. When he smiled, it was the smile of a wolf recognizing prey that had somehow challenged it. "Nurse Torres," he said, and the way he spoke her name made it sound like an accusation. "I didn't realize you'd completed medical school since yesterday." "Oh, wait, you haven't." He turned back to Mrs. Hendricks with practiced charm, his massive shoulders angled to exclude Rachel from the conversation. "Apologies for the interruption from our enthusiastic staff." Rachel's jaw clenched. A microsecond. Barely visible. But her hands remained steady as she reached for the chart, as she documented her clinical concern in the nursing notes per protocol, the only armor available to someone without a title or a degree. She wrote, "Noted morphine order 4 milligrams, recommend dose reduction to 2 milligrams based on renal function. Value support modification. Nursing assessment documented." 12 words. Bulletproof. She would not give him the satisfaction of a tremor, a defensive explanation, a single word of apology. "The medication will be ready when you authorize the change, doctor," she said, and left the room with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. But the worst was only beginning. The next day, Dr. Mercer returned to room 347 at 8:56 a.m. with an entourage. 3 residents flanking him like courtiers, the charge nurse, Patricia from the morning shift. Mrs. Hendricks looked up from her magazine with the startled expression of someone about to witness a medical emergency that had nothing to do with her husband's condition. "Nurse Torres," Mercer said, and Rachel appeared in the doorway because she'd learned that summoning worked faster than waiting to be found. "Let's discuss your concerning pattern of overstepping your scope of practice." His voice carried into the hallway. Every nurse within earshot heard it. Every resident took mental notes. This was a performance, and Mercer was a master of the stage. "You are not authorized to countermand physician orders," he continued, pacing the small room with the restless energy of someone who understood the power of movement, of spatial dominance. "Are you aware that what you did yesterday constitutes insubordination? That it violates hospital policy for point 7.2 regarding clinical hierarchy?" Rachel stood perfectly still. Her face was a mask, not blank, but controlled, the way a sentry stands at attention. The kind of composure that comes from understanding that every reaction he wanted from her was a weakness he could document and weaponize. "I documented my clinical concern per protocol, doctor," she said evenly. Her voice did not rise. Did not waver. Did not apologize. "The temp has protocols now," Mercer said, and smiled at his own observation. "Fascinating." He turned to the residents. "This is what happens when hospital administration hires temporary staff without proper oversight. They develop ideas about their place in the chain of command." Mrs. Hendricks looked horrified. Her husband, Colonel Hendricks, had closed his eyes as if he could unsee what was happening in his own room. Rachel met no one's gaze. She simply turned and left, her posture straight, her breathing even, and did not allow herself to feel anything until she was alone. The nickname stuck by noon. The temp. It was whispered in the break room, used in handoff reports, written in dry erase marker on the whiteboard next to her name when shift assignments rotated, the temp on 4. Make sure the temp knows to wait for orders. By Wednesday, the social architecture of St. Michael's had reorganized itself around her exclusion. Rachel sat down at the break room table with her sandwich, turkey on wheat, apple slices, water, and within 30 seconds, 4 nurses stood up simultaneously. They gathered their lunches. They left without speaking. One of them said something that made the others laugh once they were safely in the hallway. Rachel ate alone, staring at her sandwich, her grip on the plastic fork the only visible indicator that she was aware of what had just happened. She finished in 8 minutes and disposed of the container, washed her hands, and returned to her shift. Her hands did not shake. Her voice did not crack when she called for medications, when she documented vital signs, when she comforted a patient asking if the nurses here liked working at St. Michael's. She said nothing about the break room. She said nothing about Dr. Mercer. She said nothing at all. By Friday morning, the documentation phase had begun. Rachel arrived for her 6 a.m. shift and saw it immediately, a white paper clipped to the unit board, visible to every staff member who passed it. Her name printed clearly at the top. R. Torres, insubordination and unauthorized medical judgment, final warning. The words were bureaucratic ammunition, precise and official. She read it once. Her face revealed nothing. Her co-workers watched her read it, a brief moment of collective waiting, as if her reaction might give them permission to show what they actually felt. But Rachel simply returned the paper to the board and walked to her med cart as if Dr. Mercer had said nothing at all. She had learned in Helmand Province, in concrete rooms where the wrong expression could invite violence, that silence was a weapon. That the refusal to break was itself a form of power. But that night, alone in the parking garage at 11 p.m., with her Honda Civic idling in space 47B and the cold darkness of Denver pressing against the windows, Rachel finally allowed the mask to slip. She reached into her scrub pocket and removed a small bundle, a triangle of fabric folded with military precision, the flag that had draped a casket in a cemetery with mountains in the distance. Captain James Delgado. 3 tours. Her medic. Her friend. The person she'd been ordered to disappear after extracting during an operation the Pentagon had buried so deep that it no longer officially existed. Her hand shook as she unfolded it. Her breath came in gasps she couldn't control. The cold fabric felt like ice against her palms, like the weight of every person she'd carried, every choice she'd made, every identity she'd had to erase. She sat in the dark, in the car, with the flag spread across her lap, and allowed herself 30 seconds of absolute braking before she folded it again with shaking hands and returned it to her pocket. The next morning, she returned to St. Michael's. Dr. Mercer had filed additional documentation, a 3-inch binder titled Performance Review, R. Torres, that now sat on the HR director's desk, annotated with Mercer's red pen, exceeded scope, unauthorized assessment, failure to maintain hierarchy. He had scheduled a formal performance improvement plan meeting. He had mobilized every lever of institutional power against a temp nurse who had corrected a morphine dosage and had the audacity to do so correctly. And Rachel, sitting in her car before her shift, holding a flag that nobody knew she owned, understood that this was just the beginning. 3 weeks after room 347, Dr. Mercer stopped shouting. That was the moment Rachel understood she was in real danger. The public attacks had been predictable, the condescension, the dismissive wave of his hand when she spoke, the way he'd pause mid-sentence whenever she entered a room as if her presence interrupted his thoughts. Those she could absorb. Those left no paper trail. But silence was strategic. Silence meant documentation. Silence meant he was building something that wouldn't crumble when she spoke up. She discovered it on a Tuesday morning, taped to the break room bulletin board. A memorandum on official hospital letterhead, issued from Dr. Lawrence Mercer, Chief of Surgery. It wasn't a write-up. Not yet. It was worse. It was a performance improvement plan, 30 days, with metrics so precise they felt surgical. Demonstrated competency in protocol adherence, it read. 0 medication errors or near misses. Physician authorization required for all patient contact beyond basic vitals. Documentation review at 72-hour intervals to ensure compliance. The language was calm, professional, utterly devastating. There was no mention of room 347. No reference to the morphine dosage or the Hendricks family. Instead, it created a framework where she could not possibly succeed. The metrics weren't standards, they were traps disguised as benchmarks. Rachel stood in front of the board for 30 seconds, reading her own execution typed in Calibri font. Her jaw tightened. That was all. A small, almost imperceptible clench of muscle at her temple. Then she pulled the paper down, folded it once, and placed it in her scrub pocket. By that afternoon, she understood the full scope of what Mercer had engineered. He'd requested, no, demanded, access to her previous 6 months of shift reports. Every single charting note. Every medication administration record. Every patient interaction documented in the system. He sat in his office, a space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Denver's skyline and furniture that cost more than Rachel's car, and he annotated those reports with a red ballpoint pen like a surgeon marking incision lines. Page after page, he drew circles around entries. Here, patient repositioned without physician order, he'd written next to a note from 2 months prior where Rachel had shifted an elderly patient's position to prevent pressure ulcers. Standard nursing care, but he'd circled it anyway. Unauthorized intervention. Another page, a medication education provided to patient without physician authorization. He'd underlined the section where she'd explained to Mrs. Chen how to use her inhaler properly. He labeled it scope violation. His handwriting was precise, controlled, the penmanship of a man who understood that documentation was a weapon. He created a spreadsheet. Rachel discovered this 3 days later when she overheard 2 unit managers discussing it in hushed voices near the supply closet. Mercer had compiled 17 instances from her employment record, some real, some reinterpreted beyond recognition, and categorized them by type, insubordination, protocol deviation, unauthorized medical judgment, scope over each. Each one was dated. Each one was noted with his red pen comments. He was building a case the way prosecutors build RICO charges, not a single catastrophic failure, but a pattern so systematic it could only indicate a fundamentally flawed nurse. The restrictions came next, delivered through unit assignments that appeared routine to anyone not paying attention. Rachel, who had spent the last 6 months floating between trauma, surgical recovery, and ICU cases where her composure and efficiency were most visible, suddenly found herself reassigned. Monday, post-op wound care. Tuesday, basic vitals and comfort measures on a medical surgical floor. Wednesday, restocking supply carts and running labs. The assignments had a pattern. They isolated her from high-acuity situations where she might demonstrate competence, where she might interact with grateful patients or families, where she might be visible to anyone who might advocate for her. Her schedule shifted. No more night shifts, which had given her time to work quietly without scrutiny. Now she was assigned to day shifts exclusively, which meant she was always under observation. Mercer had orchestrated this through the unit director, always with plausible deniability. Temp nurse utilization optimization, the memo said. Better alignment with projected staffing needs. But Rachel understood what was happening beneath the bureaucratic language. He was backing her into a corner, eliminating opportunities and creating the appearance of performance issues through assignment rather than actual incompetence. The performance improvement plan metrics became impossible to navigate. 0 medication errors or near misses was technically unachievable. Even the most careful nurse could misread a decimal point or encounter a patient who refused medications. Physician authorization required for all patient contact beyond basic vitals. This meant she couldn't educate patients about their conditions. Couldn't comfort a frightened person. Couldn't use the judgment that made her an effective nurse. It was designed to reduce her to an automaton, and then, when she inevitably seemed robotic or ineffective, to document that too. Every interaction was catalogued. Mercer had positioned himself as her invisible auditor. A colleague reported that he'd walked the floor specifically looking for violations, notebook in hand, timing her tasks. She was 6 minutes late returning from lunch one day, 6 minutes due to a patient asking her a medical question near the elevator. He noted it. Time management concern. She performed a bed bath and charted it as patient hygiene assistance, terminology used by every nurse in the department. He flagged it. Insufficient specificity in documentation, he'd written. The red pen notes accumulated like wounds that wouldn't close. What struck Rachel most was the precision of the trap. This wasn't the impulsive rage of someone who'd been insulted. This was the calculated methodology of someone with institutional power who understood exactly how to weaponize it. Mercer had access to her records, control over her assignments, authority to interpret her actions, and a paper trail that made everything look legitimate. Anyone reviewing the performance improvement plan would see reasonable metrics. Anyone examining the shift reports would see red pen annotations that appeared to document genuine concerns. On paper, he looked fair, thorough, professional. But that wasn't the worst part. The real damage was happening silently, in the spaces between documentation. Other nurses watched the reassignments and understood the message. The unit director, who'd been pleasant before, now avoided her eyes during shift briefings. A senior RN who'd worked beside her for months suddenly declined to be paired for a case, citing scheduling conflicts. The staff understood what was happening. In hospital hierarchies, the doctor's word was immutable law. If Mercer had decided Rachel Torres was a problem, then she was a problem. The social isolation that had started with small cruelties, the break room exodus when she sat down, was evolving into something more comprehensive. She was becoming professionally radioactive. Rachel documented everything in return. Not to match Mercer, but to protect herself. She began writing detailed notes after every shift, times, dates, assignments, the specific metrics of the performance improvement plan she'd been assigned, confirmation of which physician had authorized which patient contact. She created her own spreadsheet, filed on a personal laptop at home where no hospital administrator could access it. She wasn't building a case. She was building insurance. The irony was that her actual nursing performance remained flawless. Her charting was meticulous. Her medication administration error rate was 0. Her patients reported satisfaction. But none of that mattered. The system Mercer had engineered didn't reward competence, it demanded perfection while simultaneously restricting the opportunities to demonstrate it. He was playing a game where the rules could change, and he controlled the rulebook. 2 weeks into the performance improvement plan, Rachel sat in her car in the St. Michael's parking lot during her lunch break and stared at the folded flag she kept in her locker. The fabric was faded. The creases were permanent now, from months of her fingers tracing the same pattern. This flag had covered a casket. This flag represented 18 months of her life she couldn't claim, operations she couldn't discuss, decisions she'd made that would never appear in any official record. She had survived things that most people couldn't imagine. And now she was being methodically dismantled by paperwork and reassignments at a hospital in Denver, Colorado. The paralysis of it struck her then. In Helmand Province, when a threat appeared, you had protocols. You had authorization to act. You had a weapon. But here, in this institutional environment, her hands were tied by systems designed specifically to protect people like Mercer. She couldn't defend herself without making things worse. She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't call in a favor or order an airstrike or extract herself from the situation. She had to wait. She had to absorb. She had to maintain her composure while being systematically destroyed by the slowest, most bureaucratically sound methodology possible. She reached for the ignition to return to her shift when her phone lit up. A text from the hospital. ER alert. Multiple incoming. ETA for minutes. And that's when everything changed. The ER doors exploded inward at 11:19 p.m. A man 6'9" with shoulders like a load-bearing wall crashed through them, his frame moving with the disconnected violence of someone whose nervous system had been chemically rewired. PCP. The chemical signature was written in his eyes, pupils blown wide, movements jerky and disconnected, strength amplified by dissociation. He was swinging a tire iron in broad arcs, the metal catching the fluorescent lights as nurses scattered backward like startled birds, their voices climbing into screams. "Get back! Get back!" the charge nurse yelled, already reaching for the panic button. Dr. Mercer was in the adjacent trauma bay. Rachel heard his voice rising, "Call security. Everyone clear the ER." He didn't move from behind the physician's desk. 20 feet away. Safe distance. Rachel was standing at the med station, her bag in one hand, half turned toward the chaos. She didn't move backward. She didn't move at all for the first 3 seconds. Just watched. The way she had watched in Helmand Province when the patrol base came under fire and younger soldiers froze, watched them to understand what they needed, what they actually feared, what would break them or save them. The man with the tire iron was screaming something, a sound more animal than human, a howl of rage and chemicals and pain. He swung the iron again and it connected with a supply cart, sending bottles of antiseptic cascading across the tile. Glass shattered. The percussion of it echoed off the walls like gunfire. Rachel set down the four bag. She moved toward him. Slow. Her hands visible and open. Her posture dropping, making herself smaller, less threatening, a teaching gesture from de-escalation training that she'd learned not in a classroom but in the field, where one wrong move meant funerals. She had a voice like a tank idling in a garage, low, steady, vibrating at a frequency that bypassed panic and went straight to the brainstem's recognition of authority. "Hey! Hey! Look at me!" He swung the tire iron again, wild and unfocused. She sidestepped it without hurrying, the movement economical and precise. "I see you," she said. "I see what you're carrying. That's a lot of weight. Don't come near me." His voice fractured between octaves, chemicals, and terror waging war in his body. "I'm not coming near you. I'm right here. I'm not moving. You're in control." She took one measured breath. "What's your name?" "Marcus." There," he gestured wildly with the tire iron, connecting with nothing but air. "Marcus." "I'm Rachel." "Marcus, you're at St. Michael's Hospital. You're safe here. Nobody's going to hurt you. But that thing in your hand, that's dangerous. For you. For people around you." A uniformed security guard was moving in from the west corridor, hand on his belt. Rachel didn't look at him, but she shifted her weight slightly, a message. "Not yet. Let this work. Marcus, I need you to listen to me. You took something tonight. Something that's making your body do things you don't want. That's okay. That happens. But right now your body is fighting itself and we need to help it stop fighting. Can you do that with me?" The tire iron lowered an inch. "What did you take, Marcus?" "Dust." "The dust." They said it would. His breathing was rapid, panicked, his chest heaving. "I can't feel my legs. I can't feel." Rachel's eyes narrowed. She'd seen this. Tension pneumothorax. His trachea was going to start deviating if his breathing got worse. Right now his neck veins were bulging like cords, and his oxygen saturation was probably already dropping. The drug had him hyped, fighting his own breathing, and if his lung collapsed. "Marcus, I need you to breathe with me. Not fast. Slow. In through your nose. For counts." She breathed. Visible. Deliberate. Like a compass needle pointing toward calm. He tried to follow. His breathing still ragged, but trying. "Keep the tire iron down, Marcus. You're doing good. You're in control here. Nobody's going to rush you. Nobody's going to make this worse. But I need you to sit down. Your body is working very hard right now. It needs to rest. His knees buckled. The tire iron clattered against the tile. Rachel moved, fluid, without hesitation, and guided him down to a seated position against the wall, her hands gentle on his shoulders, a combat medic's touch that had been trained into muscle memory across 3 tours. She could feel him shaking, his body cycling through chemicals and adrenaline and the bone-deep terror of losing control of himself. But his breathing was still deteriorating. "I need a stretcher and an EKG," she said, voice still low, still that tank-idling rumble. Not a request. A command that moved nurses toward action the way authority moves people. "Marcus, we're going to put you on a bed now. Just for a second. Just to check something." They guided him onto the stretcher. Rachel's hands were already moving, assessing his neck, palpating his trachea, noting the deviation. His oxygen saturation was at 88% and dropping. 86, 84. His chest was drawing inward on the right side. Tension pneumothorax. His lung was collapsing and the pressure was building, pushing his trachea across his midline, compressing his left lung, strangling his cardiac output. "I need a 14-gauge catheter. Now." Nurse Torres, step back, Mercer's voice cut through the organized chaos like a scalpel. "Wait for the physician." Rachel didn't acknowledge him. She was already reaching for the crash cart, ripping open the needle decompression kit, her hands moving with the terrible fluidity of someone who had done this in sandstorms and darkness and with incoming fire close enough to feel the percussion of bullets striking armor. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the textbook location, the place where a needle could release pressure and let him breathe. "Marcus, this is going to feel like a pinch." She inserted the catheter. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and unmistakable, a sound like a tire deflating, like pressure venting from a closed system, like survival hissing out of the metal needle. His body convulsed once and then his color changed, oxygen returning to his face, that grayish blue fading to something closer to human. His breathing steadied. Deep. Ragged. But working. "Sinus rhythm," someone said from the monitor. "BP is coming up." The code team arrived 40 seconds later, shouting orders, taking over with the machinery of emergency medicine, the thing that Mercer should have been leading but wasn't because he'd been standing 20 feet away, composing narratives. Rachel stepped back. Her hands weren't shaking. Her breathing was normal. She looked at the tire iron still lying on the tile floor, the empty med station, the scattered supplies, and then at Dr. Mercer, whose face had arranged itself into an expression of calculated fury. She already knew what was coming. By 6 a.m. the next morning, when the sun was still deciding whether to rise over Denver, an envelope appeared in Rachel's mailbox in the staff locker room. Formal termination papers. The language was clinical, surgical, designed to cut with precision rather than passion. Due to reckless autonomous medical practice, failure to wait for physician authorization, pattern of cowboy medicine inconsistent with hospital protocols, and endangerment of patient through unauthorized interventions, Rachel Torres is terminated effective immediately. Mercer had already written his version of the story and filed it before the ER was even cleaned. She hadn't saved Marcus's life, she'd overstepped, undermined physician authority, violated the chain of command. The needle decompression, the technique that had taken his oxygen saturation from 84% to normal in 30 seconds, the intervention that had prevented cardiac arrest and death, all of it was reframed as insubordination. As a temp nurse playing doctor. As a threat to medical hierarchy. Rachel read the letter twice. Her face remained carved from granite. She tucked the papers into her locker, then began removing things, her personal stethoscope, the laminated patient care cards, the backup granola bars she kept in the side pocket. She moved with the efficiency of someone packing a field bag, muscle memory taking over again. The folded flag came last. She'd kept it on the top shelf behind the spare compression bandages, the fabric worn soft from 18 years of careful handling, from the day they'd given it to her in a small box at Arlington with Sergeant James Whitmore, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines embroidered on the presentation card. She wrapped it in a grocery bag, tucked it under her arm, and walked out of St. Michael's at 6:44 a.m. without looking back. That night she was sitting in an empty diner on Colfax Avenue, the kind of place that existed in the margins between midnight and dawn, where the coffee was always just below scalding and the waitress never asked questions. It was 3:12 a.m. The mug in front of her had gone cold an hour ago, a skin forming on top of the black liquid, a small catastrophe of temperature and time. Rachel was staring at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her was someone she didn't recognize, not the temp nurse from St. Michael's, not the soldier from Helmand, but something in between. A ghost. A person who had been ordered to disappear and had spent 18 years perfecting the technique, and now the hospital had done the job for the Pentagon, had erased her so completely that she was beginning to wonder if she had ever actually existed at all. The rain started without warning, hammering the diner windows like applause for a performance nobody had been watching, and Rachel sat there in the fluorescent-lit booth with the cold coffee and the folded flag in the grocery bag and wondered, not for the first time, if running was supposed to feel this permanent. Rachel was still sitting in the booth when her phone buzzed at 4:11 a.m. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But 18 years of conditioned response took over. Unknown numbers meant information, information meant survival, survival meant moving. She picked up. Captain Torres. The voice was clipped, military adjacent, federal. This is Special Agent Marcus Webb, Department of Defense Security Services. We need to talk about what happened at St. Michael's Hospital in the last 72 hours. The coffee in front of her had gone the color of old pennies. She didn't ask how they'd found her. They'd always known where she was. That was the arrangement. Stay invisible, stay gone, stay grateful for the erasure. I'm listening, Rachel said. Dr. Lawrence Mercer filed a background investigation request on your personnel file yesterday morning. Standard HR procedure, he claimed. Except your personnel file doesn't exist in any hospital system. Which means he was searching for something that shouldn't exist, which means he triggered 14 automatic alerts at the Pentagon's personnel security device. We have 2 agents en route to St. Michael's Hospital as we speak. You need to know what's about to happen. Rachel set down the coffee. Outside, Denver was beginning to wake. Delivery trucks. A city bus hissing to a stop. The ordinary machinery of people who had nothing to hide. Tell me, she said. Mercer violated federal security protocols by initiating background verification on an officer whose DoD codename appears on a classified need-to-know list. That's a felony. But here's the thing, when we subpoena his request logs, we're not just looking at your file. We're looking at all of them. And when the hospital's lawyers get wind of a federal security investigation, they panic. Hospital systems always panic. They start pulling records. They start looking for liability. And sometimes they find things nobody wanted them to find. The sound of paper shuffling came through the phone. Documents. Files. Evidence. We pulled Mercer's surgical records as part of the background audit, Webb continued. Routine cross-reference. Captain, I'm looking at 17 cases of documented malpractice buried under falsified surgical reports. 17. Complications blamed on nursing staff. Incident reports altered to deflect responsibility. There's a patient death 18 months ago, officially listed as unexpected cardiac event. It was a nick to the hepatic artery he failed to identify, then covered up with creative charting. There's another case where an anesthesia complication he caused was documented as a medication administration error by nursing. We have documents going back 8 years. Rachel's hand was steady on the phone. Her voice came out level. What happens now? Now the state medical board gets involved. Now the hospital's risk management team launches a parallel investigation because they're terrified of federal scrutiny. Now every altered report, every falsified note, the same bureaucratic weapon he used to terrorize your colleagues, becomes evidence. His own meticulous documentation system becomes the trail that proves he's been lying for nearly a decade. He's finished, Captain. The thing he built to destroy you just destroyed him. The line went quiet except for traffic sounds in the background. A siren. Then Webb again, quieter. There's more. The nurses he isolated, the ones who abandoned you in the break room. They are starting to talk now. An anesthesiologist just filed a complaint she's been sitting on for 6 months about his complication rates. Once one person talks, the dam breaks. By noon today, every nurse who stayed silent out of fear is going to realize the threat level just inverted. He's not the apex predator anymore. He's the exposed liability. Rachel watched the rain continue its assault on the diner windows. She thought about Mercer building his case, document by document, file by file, each one a carefully constructed brick in the structure of his authority. She thought about those 17 patients. 18 months of wondering if that cardiac event was really just bad luck. Families still grieving, believing the hospital's official story. "When do your agents arrive?" she asked. 40 minutes. They'll approach hospital administration first. By the time Mercer realizes why his office is being sealed, by the time he understands that his own weapons have turned against him, you should be somewhere else. Somewhere official. Somewhere with witnesses. The investigation will clear you. More than clear you. It will vindicate you completely. She hung up at 5:03 a.m. and drove through empty Denver streets toward St. Michael's Hospital. The rain had softened to mist. The sky was the color of old concrete. She parked in the employee lot and walked through the ER entrance like she'd walked through 100 emergency rooms in 100 cities across 18 years, head up, steady hands, the kind of presence that made people unconsciously make space. The night shift was still running. Rodriguez was charting at the station. Martinez was prepping medications. They looked up when she walked in, their faces shifting from exhaustion to confusion to something closer to concern. "Rachel." Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly. "What are you doing here?" Mercer said. "Mercer's having a difficult morning," Rachel said quietly. "You should hear him out when he comes in. He has a lot to explain." She was halfway to the locker room when the first 2 federal agents in dark suits entered through the main entrance, followed minutes later by hospital security. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We're in the administrative wing. Stay visible. You're the witness now." In the locker room, Rachel opened her assigned locker and looked at her temporary badge. 3 more hours and her shift would have technically ended. She pulled on her scrubs anyway and returned to the ER floor. By 6:15 a.m., word had begun to spread. Mercer was in a meeting with administrators and federal investigators. His office was being sealed pending the security review. A nurse named Jen, who'd been among those who'd abandoned Rachel in the break room, caught her eye across the station and looked away, shame pooling in her expression like spilled blood. The next hours unfolded with the mechanical precision of institutional collapse. The hospital's risk management team called an emergency meeting. The board of directors was notified. By 9:06 a.m., Mercer's attorney had been contacted. By 10:36 a.m., his medical license was under formal review. By noon, he was being escorted from his office by security, a cardboard box of personal items in his arms, family photos, medical textbooks, a fountain pen that had probably cost more than Rachel's first car. The towering giant who'd built his authority on intimidation looked suddenly small under the fluorescent lights, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to fold into himself. Rachel watched from the medication station as the nurses he'd cultivated as allies turned away from him. The same people who'd gathered their lunches and left when she sat down. The same people who'd whispered behind their hands. Now they looked at him like he was a contagion, which, in institutional terms, he was exposure risk. The hospital's survival depended on his complete removal. By the end of the week, the full scope of his malpractice had been documented. 23 cases under investigation. 17 confirmed falsifications. The state medical board held an emergency meeting. Dr. Lawrence Mercer's medical license was permanently revoked. The words "never to practice medicine in any state" were written into the official record with the finality of a closing grave. 6 months passed. Rachel continued working nights, and the hospital's new chief of surgery, a soft-spoken trauma specialist from Walter Reed named Dr. Patricia Hayes, had approached her about developing a combat medicine training program for emergency staff. Nothing official. No publication. No media. Just quiet, methodical competence rebuilding the institutional trust that Mercer had spent years destroying. Rachel stood in full scrubs now, her badge reading what her badge should have always read: Rachel Torres, RN, BSN, Captain, United States Army Special Forces, retired. The credentials that should never have been hidden. The name that should never have been erased. The identity that had always been, underneath the 18-year performance of invisibility, exactly who she was. On her locker door, she taped a photograph of Miguel in his rock dress uniform, his eyes bright with the particular clarity of purpose that came from knowing what you were training toward. Beside the photo, she'd attached the folded flag, the triangle of fabric that had draped a casket in Helmand Province, that she'd carried through airport security in her locker, that she'd held at 3 a.m. in her car when no one was watching. No longer hidden. Finally allowed to remember. Colonel Hendricks had visited her twice since his discharge. His wife had come the second time, and in her eyes Rachel saw the recognition of what it meant to witness injustice in silence. They didn't need to talk about it. They both understood that the default was cowardice, and it took nothing to choose it. They understood what it cost to stay silent, and they understood that sometimes the silence lasted longer than the violence ever could. Across Denver, in a fluorescent-lit classroom at Front Range Community College, Dr. Lawrence Mercer stood in front of a group of bored teenagers, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy with a face that looked vaguely horrified to be spending eternity beneath his hands. He earned $16 an hour. He would never practice medicine again. He would never hold another person's life in the balance. The system he'd spent 8 years corrupting had recalibrated itself toward justice with the mechanical efficiency of institutional self-preservation, not because it cared about rightness, but because exposure was more costly than accountability. That night, Rachel finished her shift at 7:11 a.m. and drove home where Miguel was studying for his military entrance exams, his laptop open to the application portal, his hand steady on the keyboard. She sat beside him and looked at the screen: name, date of birth, service intent. The visible architecture of a future that didn't require hiding. "You're going to be good at this," she said quietly. "Like you," Miguel answered. She didn't correct him. Not because it wasn't true, she had been extraordinary at what she'd been trained to do. But because for the first time in 18 years, she didn't have to measure her words against the possibility of discovery. She could be visible. She could be known. She could be, finally, exactly what she'd always been. That night, she slept without the dream of mortars in Helmand Province. Without the sound of rotor blades that would never land. Without the ghost of her teammate's voice asking, in that specific moment before everything changed, if she thought they'd make it home. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you're watching this, share it with someone who's been underestimated. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors walking among us. And ask yourself, have you ever been completely wrong about someone?